So we covered basically the first half of the book last week. This week, the second half of the book, plus some really fun stuff on some special issues that are in the book, and some math about what issues are most difficult to get and how they kind of lay themselves out in a cost curve. 236A1. I remember trading for this patch. The Atlanta Traderie, staying in the same hotel where the Atlanta Falcons were. I don't know when this was, in the early 80s. 236A1. And if anyone wasn't with us last week, this is how they're all set up. I give the lodge name, what is the issue, and a price point. And a price points are about as good as long as it takes to type it, and then they're out of date. But if you put this piece plus or minus 10 or 20%, that's probably where it lies. The key to determining this issue, which is what this book is all about, how do you determine the exact WOB issue? The key is it's 64 millimeters by 83, and it is a no twill. The name is the top, but there's no number. So I'm telling you in blue, anytime you see blue text, it refers to something that's not in the WOB handbook. So blue text telling you, if you look at the 236A1B, it's twill right. A1A is no twill, so that's the distinguishing factor. And then A2 through A7, they all have the lodge number, so it's very easy to determine they're not in the WOB issue. 237A1A. David Weed was on last week. This issue is very close to us. We both received our vigil in 237. And I was in the lodge for 10 or 15 years before I even heard about this issue. It again is a no twill issue. I probably had 6 or 8 of the A1s, but they were all A1Bs. So it's a little more difficult to turn up, but they're certainly out there. It's rated around 30. 239A1, again, mine is not in really good shape, but this presentation is about what's in our collections, and this is my collection. It is a fairly large patch. And by the way, this page and all the others are scaled on each page. So the largest patch on each page should be scaled to the others on the page. So here's one that's almost 100 millimeters tall. It is white, twill right. No other patch looks like it from that lodge, so it's pretty easy to get. I mean, pretty easy to determine. 240R1 is the WOB issue. It is misspelled. If you look at the spelling, N-E-A-T-I, A-T-I, that's misspelling. The word, the proper spelling is down here on the R2. It's N-E-Y-A-T-I. So another one that's pretty easy to determine. Get the one that's misspelled, and you have the WOB issue. Okay, so now we start to get in some interesting things. I may have mentioned last week there are 2 prototypes in the Wabaningo Handbook, which means there are 2 issues actually listed in the book that there are only one of. And one of those is the 242 YX1. Now, if I look in ISCA Images, it says that the WOB issue is a C1. So when I started this, first thing I do is I get a high resolution picture of the WOB image, and I start comparing it to online images to make sure I can determine what's what. Well, I didn't see anything on the ISCA Images that looked like what I saw in the WOB book. So we're going to cover this in detail later, but suffice it to say that the image in the WOB book is not the 242C1. It is the YX1. The dimensions are similar. The tail is in front of the arrow, which is particularly important on this issue. But when we get to Appendix F, we're going to talk about this issue some more. Okay, Tulpi, not sure if that's how you say it. By the way, I will try to pronounce some of the names. I'm telling you now, I'm the worst in the world about pronouncing these names. I've always been a number collector and didn't understand how to say the names, but I'm saying this is Tulpi. It is the R1 issue, rated 46. It's 74 millimeters in diameter, and it is twill right. There's no other issue that looks a lot like it, so it's pretty easy to determine. The next issue, here's a good one. Wakota. See, this is ranked in the high 90s, so it's about as good as it gets. It is the A1 issue. It is 71 millimeters by 73 millimeters, and if you're holding it, It's probably 2 or 3 millimeters thick. It's really thick felt. It is a red arrow on a tree. To the right, you can see I have a designation showing you the ZA. ZA1 and ZA2 both have arrows silk screened in the gap. You see a little bit of a white gap in there? That's not on the real patch. That's just on the reproduction. So you got a little white stream or under your red arrow, you do not have a genuine 246A1. By the way, down here at the bottom, I have a little asterisk. It means I turned up some interesting information, putting the book together. The lodge was formed and chartered August 6, 1943 in Fenimore, Cooper Council, White something, New York. The name Wakota has no meaning. The lodge totem is a fir tree, which makes sense. That's what they show there. Wabaningo R1A, 78 millimeter diameter. Now there is an R1B and an R1C. They have thick duck. The duck neck is thick. So you see this on the R1A is kind of a thin neck. Over here you can see R1B has a thicker neck detail and vertical periods. All right, moving on, 249A1. Pretty good piece. This is a Neil blue flocked sateen, 74 millimeters by 95. Nothing else looks a lot like it, so it's pretty easy to determine. 251C 2.5. 95 millimeter chenille, and there's lots of chenilles from this lodge. So the factors that one must look at if you want to get the exact wob issue, if you're looking for this 3 C's in the cloud, and you're looking for a type 5 label. So last week we talked about SPC labels. In the beginning of the handbook of my presentation, it shows what they all are. You can look in most any blue book and get the designation, but I put a little copy there for you to see. Also information I dug up say that these were issued in 1951, around 12 of them to the LEC. No other 251C has 3 C's in the cloud. They have different designs in the cloud, so that's the critical thing to look at for that piece. 252A1, one of the more common wob issues. They must have issued a lot of them. Red TP, yellow lettering, not highly rated, but a good collectible issue from the wobs. 254A1, yellow twill right, light brown deer. So there is an A2, and it's similar, but it has a brown deer and lettering. And to help you discern the two, in the bottom right of that picture I'm telling you, you can see how much darker the deer is in the lettering. It's let's say this is almost like a tan, and this is a brown. Okay, 256X2, good piece. Silk screen on paper, this is one of my needs. It's a brown deer on white rock. They have multiple pieces that look like this, but they change the color of the deer and they change the color of the rock, but the X2 is the wob piece. 257R1, one of the more common wob issues. It is also a no twill, horizontal black bear with ears together. So if you could blow that up, you'd see his ears almost look like one ear, but there's really two. But it is no twill. And the note here telling you that twill right details are typical on R2 through R4. No twill in the wob, twill right on the knob wob. 258A1, boy, this is a beautiful patch. Fairly large, felt on felt. Information I dug up suggested it came out in 1948. Nothing else looks just like it, although there are others that are not felt that are of this design. But if you have a felt piece, it looks like this, you have the A1. And look how large it is compared to the 260X1. Remember, these are scaled approximately the same page to page. So here's now a 73 millimeter diamond, red silk screen felt. Arrowheads do not touch the lines. If these, see these arrows coming up in the right flank and the left flank? They do not touch that line, which is pretty hard to see in this magnification. So you can see right there, those arrows do not touch that line. And there's an X1B where the arrowhead lines on the left side touch. So there's an X1B and X1A. Look for that where the arrowhead touches, and you'll see whether you have the WAB issue or not. 268C1, kind of a sleeper. You don't see many of those. There's a C2 out there, but it has dates on it. The main thing is to look for a type 8B label. This one, these two are too long for me to actually fit on one row. So these two names wrap 268C1 and 271. The 271 X1A, I recently got what I thought was an X1A. I say recently, in the last few years. But when I really looked at it correctly, the arrowhead on the X1B, where my cursor is different than the X1A. X1B has a triangular arrowhead detail. X1A is barbed. Very similar in size, 54 by 76 versus 44 by 76. So this one's a little bit thinner, but that's how to tell. Look for those dimensions and some it's a little wider than its predecessor. So here's another very interesting piece. I, like I said last week, have thought of myself as somewhat of a WAB expert for at least 20 years. I learned so much putting this book together. All I remember hearing was the 272 pictured in the book was one that was made and there was no number on it. And so the author, Dwight Bichelle, just put a number on it so everyone would know. And then I thought all the other 272s didn't have a number either, because that's not a flap in my collection. But it turns out the real truth is the piece in the Wabaningo Handbook is an absolute one-of-a-kind prototype. It has a brown dove versus a gray dove. And I think someone was asking what's the most rare piece. Well, money-wise, this is certainly it. This is rated 100 for the brown prototype. And the last 3 times this patch has changed hands, it went for $50,000 each time. So it is the most valuable piece. I'm not sure it's the most sought after because it's a prototype. The 272 itself, the F1, they all have a number, but you can see how dramatically different it is when it's stitched versus when it looks like it might have been put on with lacing or some more accurate number, but both terrific pieces. I grew up in Region 9D, which was where this lodge was. I traded with people in that lodge for years. Never knew anybody who had this flap, much less the prototype. We'll talk about that some more in Appendix G. Okay, 277R1. Last week somebody held this patch up. It is certainly one of my favorites too. It is the felt version of the 277R. There are twill versions which are very nice, but they don't hold a candle to this felt guy. 271 X1, pretty easy to determine. There's an X2, X3 have black beavers. So if you have a Oklahoma shaped patch with a gray beaver, you're staring at the WAB issue. 282 X2, oval, blue flocking, and orange felt. It is described in the WAB handbook, but not actually pictured. So I'm pretty sure this is it. Although I've seen old documentation from California collectors where there's another piece significantly more rare than this, and I would imagine Albertus knows about this. Royana Lodge of the Arrow. It doesn't have the word order or something like that, so I don't know the history, but very, very tough piece, and I've only seen pictures of it. But for what you and I might run into, this is it. Not particularly difficult. That's the one. Notice it's a red box around it, so that means whatever's in the WAB handbook is either not shown, or it's hand-drawn, or it's been altered in some manner. So same thing with 284 R1. There's a drawing, a crude drawing shown of this in the WAB handbook, so Dwight wasn't actually able to get a photograph of it, so he put in a picture. And this is the piece they're describing. By the way, while I'm thinking of it, there was only one gentleman, to my knowledge, that's ever had every Wabaningo issue. Rick Obermeyer pointed out last week that there was a gentleman who was very active in Florida OA in the 40s and ran into Dwight at the 1950 NOAC, and this gentleman loaned his patches to Dwight to photograph. He didn't know he was Dwight at the time, And 2.5 years later, a copy of the Wab Handbook comes back with this gentleman's patches. And he looked at it, and talking to Rick, he thinks about 30% of the patches in the Wab Handbook came from his collection. I want to say his name is Ferris, but I added it to the introduction if we have time to go back to that. So not even Dwight had a complete collection, but David Ordle did, and I believe he's the only one. 286X1, pretty easy to determine. Nothing else looks just like it. It's interesting that their totem is a brown wild dog. 287R1, a beautiful piece. I think I got this from Danny Lasquenas. 108 millimeter diameter. Nothing else really looks like it. Pretty easy to determine. 292X1A. There are several that are close to this, but you want the one that has white twill right. The X1B has no twill. 296R2, one of my favorite lodges, because my German teacher in high school was from this lodge, and he brought her flap in one day to German class and wouldn't trade it to me at all, and I don't blame him. So I've always liked this lodge. It's a spectacular history. There's nothing I don't like about it. And their early R's are beautiful. It has a small N in the name. Now I say there's a very similar R3 and R4 that have a normal N. 297X1. Boy, we were really moving into the special pieces here. This is certainly one of my favorites. It is red silkscreen triangle on white felt. It's a 99, so there's not much more difficult than this. Certainly one of my favorites. 302A1. This is kind of a sleeper. I had several A1s in my collection, in my Wab collection, thinking I had a dupe, because I do that. If I can get a dupe, I get it, put it in the collection. I keep thinking someday I'll run into someone who wants to trade Wab issues. And when I really started putting this book together, I noticed I had the wrong one. Again, I make a blow up of the Wab issue, compare it to mine. I can look for the letters are tagged. I look for the twill direction, look for oddities about the design. And on this one, it's red twill right, 3 horizontal lines above the teepee flap. So if you look right in here, here's a detail. Here's the A1. There are 3 little lines. That's the Wab issue. What I had was down here, and it has 2 vertical lines, A1B. So this is something that I think Tom Quinn turned this up for me from Oklahoma. But that's how to tell the difference, and that one's a little more subtle, so be careful. 302R1, there's only a drawing in the Wab Handbook. Here's a picture of the drawing, and there's an explanation that I've run into that shows that WW forms a triangle on the original sketch. See where my cursor is as a triangle, and when they actually made the patch, it came down at an angle. And the lettering and the turtle are also different. If you look at this design and versus this design, the drawing that someone sent, Dwight Bichelle said, this is what we plan to make. It's close, it just isn't what they made. It's even described as the proposed emblem in the Wab Handbook. Okay, 307R4, this is another 9D piece. It is white twill right, and look at this, flat rolled edge. So an early 50 round with a rolled edge. I'd say that's peculiar. Most of the other rounds are cut edge. 309 A2A and A2B, and I list both of them because if you look at the Wab book, it resembles A2A and B, hence they're both considered Wab issues because there's only a drawing. This is the drawing in the Wab Handbook, and by my eye, there's no way I can look at that and determine is it the A1A or A1B? I'm sorry, is the A2A or A2B's actual Wab issue? So I'm calling them both. And again, there's a red box around it because what's in the Wab Handbook is not an actual patch, or it is a altered patch. 314X1, again, I had this one wrong. I had the X2 in the collection with horizontal hair. What you want is vertical hair, red twill right. Here's a detail of the hair in X2, and it is horizontal. 316R1, again, this has just a description of the Wab Handbook, so there's red line around it, but no picture. But 73 millimeter diameter, white twill left, there's nothing else looks like it. If you get that, you've got the Wab issue. 317R2A, Um, there is an R2B. It says white twill right, G tags the outer border, 7 tags the inner border. So you look at this G, see the tag there, and the 7 tags the inner border. Neither the G nor the 7 tag the borders on R2A, which is the note in blue, which again refers to something that's not the Wob issue. 318A1 has to be one of the most beautiful embroidered felt pieces I've ever seen. Come out in 1948. Nothing else looks just like it. There's some other twill issues, but this guy is a standout. Congratulations to that designer. 325A1A. There are several A1s, and this cannot be determined by the Wob handbook. But if you have the piece in your hands and you have the other piece in your hands, you can see that the red twill shows through the horizontal stitch. So if you can blow this up, you can see a little bit of red twill throwing through the goat. But if you have A1, B, and C in front of you, you can see this has very, goat stitching is very heavy gauze background. Whereas A1, B, and C, you can really see the red. So under my cursor, you can see the ghosting or the backing is not heavy at all. And I noticed Rick Obermeyer's on here, 326R3. There are several varieties that have the WWW in the state. But when I looked really closely at the Wob issue, it seems to match this one, which has kind of an indistinct W down here by the council. So there are several R3s with the 3 W's in the state, but there are some where this is not distinct, but I'm pretty sure by the Wob handbook, you want the one with that W's a little bit crowded. 327A 0.5. Now, I spent many years with Rick in Florida before I moved here in about 2000 to Texas, and Waco is right up the street from us, so I thought for sure I'd be able to pick up one of these 327 arrowheads, no problem. I just didn't consider it being an issue. And after 20 years in Texas, this is the first one I have seen. It is white twill right. The white shows through the feather. That's the critical thing. If you look right here at the feathers, the Wabaningo issue, you can see the veins of the feathers. The typical 327A1B and A1C, you cannot see the feather details, and they are fairly easy to get. 327A.5, very good piece. Look for the details. 329X1A, I thought that David Lasquenas had dug one of these up for me at NOAC, but I haven't heard from him yet. But it has a backward C in the chest. If you look right here, there are multiple 329 Indian felt on felts, but that backward C, if you can see where my cursor is circling, that's the critical piece on 329. Pretty good piece. 334X1B. We're going to talk about more of this later, and it's kind of complicated. If you look at all these letters, these all tag to the upper border. And when we get to Appendix H, you can see this one was particularly difficult to identify because nothing in the ISCA online images match what's in the Wob handbook. There's X1A and X1C, which have an oval or a square O. We'll talk about that in a minute. 340X1A, I think Michael mentioned last week, there is no such thing, and he's right. They describe it in the Wob handbook as a blue border. It's only a drawing, but they say it's a blue border, and to my knowledge, the only shield ever put out by 340 that has a blue border is the ZX1, and that the yellow or gold twill shield from 340 is certainly the Wob issue, and I'm not sure how it's been determined, but the twill left issue is what's designated the Wob issue. I forgot to ask David Orl that question, but I suspect that he or maybe Dennis Sadowski would know. But that's a difficult piece to get. The twill left, twill light is fairly common. Rick Overmeyer, you know anything about this? You're the Florida expert.
I sent you documentation that it may be a no twill.
Interesting. Okay. All right, I don't think I've ever seen a no twill. All of mine are twill right, and Roger Ward is getting me a twill left. If there's a no twill, I can believe it. I certainly
We
can't tell
we
from
did
the
a
drawing.
catalog in '95 and pictured 3 shields, and the first Timucuan shield we picture is one with no twill.
Interesting. All right.
I sent you it's an attachment to an email I sent you.
Okay, I need to revisit that. 342A2A usually comes on a red and white silk neckerchief. 75 by 106 millimeter. It's pretty easy to determine this, and there's an A2B. 343R2. The main thing to look at is to the right. You can see it has an R1, has a horizontal stitched ear. Similar R1 has a horizontal left ear. So when you're looking for the R2 issue, this is blue embroidered felt. The right person to talk about this is Larry Lane. He has one of these beasts. It is only a picture in the Wab Handbook, and it was altered. So see, that's why there's a red line around it, is because it's just a picture, and to see, so you could see it, he actually drew in the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Well, it turns out that subsequent issues actually had an eye. F2 has a red eye, but the piece that's shown here is the correct Wab issue. And as Larry pointed out, there's a double stitching in this border, which is not in F2. So if someone decides they want to bleach out the eye on an F2 and claim it's an F1, you'll have a very tough time reproducing that double row stitching in the border. 349A1A, it's red twill right, came out in 47. Very similar A1C has a twill variation. If you look at them really close, you can pick that up. Here's another one I had wrong. I picked up an R2 years ago and thought it was the R1, but it is 104 millimeter diameter embroidered purple felt, defined fletching. That's critical. Defined fletching and a rounded O with a continuous river. If you look at over here to the right, these are all particular to the R2 issue. Kind of a squared O, very different looking fletching, and a non-continuous river. So those are the critical things to look for. See a black and white picture, it's hard to pick up color variations, but you can certainly see those features. And so be careful looking at that. 353X1A, Georgia piece, I think. Similar X1B and X1C have double stitched diagonal fletching. So look at the stitching on the fletching. It's basically just solid. And if you look at the other issue, see the stitch goes up to the top of the stitching and goes down to the bottom of the fletching. So bidirectional stitching on the fletching, you don't have the Wab issue. 354X1, red flocked salmon on sateen. And if you look at the stripes on it, see this is kind of a solid stripe. The X2 has kind of a multi-line stripe, and these are typically sewn on red and white silk neckerchiefs. 360R1, one of the easier Wab issues. There's an R2 that has a rolled edge. R1's pretty easy to determine, but there is a fake, so be careful about that. 370J1, wow. So here's one of my favorites in the entire book. For years, I'm embarrassed to admit, I thought the Wabaningo issue was the smaller of the two. It is certainly the jacket patch is the Wabaningo issue, is significantly larger, 152 millimeters of diameter. So you see it's twice the size of the 360. 50 emblems were made. For some reason, that information was actually in the Wab Handbook. Don't know why, because that typically was not listed. But it is also shown in the Wab Handbook that they were already inactive by the time Dwight put this together. And then we'll talk about that again in Appendix J. R1 is only 75 millimeters of diameter, which is what I thought for years was a Wab issue. R1, great piece, but not the Wab issue. J1, greater piece, is the Wab issue. 374A1A, larger piece than one might think. The critical issues, it's an A1 and the scallop is above the G. See this little scallop in the border? This little border comes around right here. It ends above the G. There are multiple varieties of this piece, and they do not end there. So be careful where the scallop ends and how far it extends over the G. 270, 375A1, there's nothing else close to it. Dark yellow flocked bear on blue sateen. It's almost black, dark blue. 376 R1B, this is a sleeper. I have maybe had half a dozen R1s. Can't my boy, who's the big guy out of Detroit, traded me one on a business trip once when it was a need of mine. And all of mine were wrong. You want the R1B. The R1A is twill left rough with smaller opened mouth. So if you looked at that detail, the mouth of that beaver is actually open. And if you look at the R1B, it's a little bit darker. The lettering is darker and the mouth is closed. That turns out to be the one I don't have. 284X1, it is a felt piece, silkscreen felt. Nothing else is close. They have an X2 that I show here on the right, but it is a twill issue. 386 R1. They have an R1B, brown border and 7mm thick deer. It's a little bit thinner deer and not quite as dark. 388A2, solid red feather and red WWW. That's what's critical in this thing right here. 395 R1. If you look right up in here, these are very thin. These antlers are very thin, and the WW is almost an afterthought. You can't hardly read that it's there. By the time you get to R2, it's thicker antlers, and the WWW is a little easier to read. Both good pieces, both very historical pieces, 395. So 397A1. Boy, this was, again, a neighboring state. I thought it'd be something I'd pick up pretty easy when I moved to Texas. Gene told me that a lot of these were burned or lost in floods. So it turned out to be a little more difficult to get. The critical thing is blue, twill, right, horizontal circle. So all this stitching behind the pelican is horizontal white. 397 has vertical white if you're looking at A2. Significant value difference between A1 and A2. I would guess A2 is a $75 patch. 401 R2A, similar, very similar. R2B has a pale green center. See it have this different color? It's hard to make your colors match exactly right on PowerPoint, but it is a little bit lighter green. I had to have both in front of me to determine that. 404A1, notice the red box. The arrow and the name were highlighted with, looks like it might have been whiteout or something in the Wab Handbook because you just couldn't see it. And because of that, you really can't determine the variety. So I picked A1A. I might want to add A1B on there. 412L1, 412 was put out a lot of leathers. They were doing this before the Wabaningo Handbook. If you don't get one with a physical number on the back, it's difficult to tell because obviously they're all handmade, and there's a little stencil that they stenciled in this pine tree with the wolf's head. There's an L1B that is dark green inked tree, where you see this one is almost black. So I would say look for something with a name and date in the back, which is very typical of these, and some of them, so I put this one in, some of them have this arrow that was attached. They don't all have that. 419C1, there's nothing else that looks just like this from the Lodge. Late 40s issue is definitely a Type 5 SPC label, and there's a little window view of what that looks like. Only chenille issue by the Lodge. Pretty famous if you're a chenille collector, and I'm not a chenille collector, but this is certainly one of my favorites from the Wab Handbook. 426, Mr. Rosenthal, I think, actually got that for me maybe in the last 6 months. 426 R2A, again, it seemed to be a pattern that when they first started stitching these, this is R2A, the fletching, they just kind of stitched all in one direction. And lodges much have kind of complained of that over time because typically subsequent issues, they stitch the fletching in at least two directions. So this crude fletching is the key to the 426 R2A. R2B and R2C, subsequent issues, have more defined fletching. 431 R1A, and again R1D. I'm showing both those match the Wob Handbook as closely as I can determine. Because the photo was altered, I can't really nail it down, but similar R1B and R1C are no twill varieties. I can see the twill in the Wob Handbook. So I know it's not R1B, and I know it's not R1C. It's one of those two. Another drawing, 438R1 is just this drawing. That's exactly what it is. Nothing else in the Wob Handbook looks just like it. And something that I've just noticed recently, the green willow spelled WWW. So if you look at this, use your imagination a little, they'll form WWW across there. Might be easier to see in the actual drawing. Because of the drawing, I'm saying R1A and R1B are both considered Wob issues. One of the easier pieces in the Wob Handbook, 106 R1A, which is interesting because their flaps are difficult. Their early flaps are difficult to get. So they must have made a lot of these rounds. The main thing is right eye is a dot and there's a vertical black line between the eyes. So you see this line going right, separating the eyes. That's R1A. If you look at R2, there's no line there. They're both pretty common pieces, but that's how to tell the difference. 276 R1, I think this is the only piece that is made to have another piece set with it, which is not shown. But 106, a 108 millimeter diameter, it has an arrow protruding out, so that is a single piece. That's not an extra sewed on arrow. It has no number in red lettering, and somewhere along the line I was told that this Camp Rock Enon was designed to fit right inside the center. So when I finally turned up one of those, it looks like that's a good story. R2, R3, R4 all have numbers. So you see there's no number on this patch. 373 R1A. Orange twill right. There's 4 letters that tag the border. The 3 and the 7 tag the arrow. So you got to look at the 3 and the 7 here and look at these 4 letters. There's an R1B but has dissimilar tags. Otherwise, those two are very close to the Wob issue. So we're getting towards the end of the book here now. Region patches were extremely difficult to get. We talked about that briefly last week. So here's one that by the time this came around, this shows up in the superseded emblems section of the Wob Handbook. So that means all these, there was something Lodge had issued by the time the Wob Handbook came out that came out after these. So in being Region 9, I don't ever remember seeing anybody that had this, even the professionals. Came out in 1940. I didn't get in scouting until mid-60s, so I guess that would explain why. An absolute classic design, and we talk about this in the patch design class at Philmont, is it's basically a 2-color patch, but you can tell a lot from it. It's very well done. 7R2, we all know 7 Lodge 7 was immense in size. Had to be one of the largest in the nation at that time, maybe with 39 Chapagat. So even though this is a felt piece, probably from the late 40s, are still pretty common, and I only gated it about an 18. But there are no other felt ob shapes issued by Wasabi. Here's a sleeper, 22X1B. Again, I probably had 5 or 6 of these showing in my Wob Handbook, saying I had lots of dupes. I didn't have any that was the right piece. And the critical thing to look at is these W's. WWW, but there's a period after the first 2 W's. There's not a period after the third W. I've never noticed that. It also has an SPC Type 5 label. There's an X1A, but it has a Type 3.7 label. And again, that we just talked about that last week, but the blue book will show you the difference between those. Okay, we're getting about to start the fun stuff. More superseded emblems, 77 X1, absolute classic, felt on felt. All of the badges from this lodge are round, so that's you got one that looks like that, you got the Wob issue. 126 R1, another kind of sleeper. They have lots of rounds, and they're all pretty easy to get once you get beyond R2. So the R1, don't know why, because it was a very large lodge. Okay, 197 A2. Now notice last week we talked about A1. But according to Dwight's book, this showed up in the superseded emblem. So according to Dwight, information he at the time suggested this piece came out before the green one. Remember last week we talked about this. There's one that looks just like it, but it's green. Anyway, I'm not into renumbering things, so I'm saying it's listed as A2 by ISCA, but it's likely issued before A1. Red, twill, right. Now, okay, so here's a section that people tend to ignore. This is the totems in the back of the book. So there are 6 or 5 totems shown, and they talk about, I think, 7 of them. It turns out that 2 of these, this one right here, and I think the one from 271, although they're listed, they were never made. So this 86 neckerchief slide was made. This Lodge 96 is still used today. That's a deer horn. 140 has a hammered arrowhead. 194 has, I think, is a bronze shield with a thunderbolt. That 86 slide is an absolute bugger. The only one I know of is in the collection of Gene Berman. And you look at the dates where this thing came along. Came around chartered in 36. It was long gone by 47. I was fortunate enough to just get a picture of it. Never seen one in life, but I would have to put that way up in my list of cool stuff from the Wob Handbook. So this just gives you information on what some of the other totems look like, because the information is not out there, and folks online have been very nice to give me this information. So Lodge 231 still has this. This is actually a stylized turtle, and the number of knots and where they are tell you about what rank you are in the lodge. Are you in the executive committee? Are you past or present lodge chief? Are you an advisor? That's what these knots mean. I think that was pretty cool. Here's some others that give you a show. They're normally on laces and often overlooked because there's so few shown in the Wob Handbook, but not easy to track down. Okay, so this is the portion of the presentation where we talk about, now that I've compiled this information, what does it show us about the bulk of the collection? So here I'm telling you that I'm raising my hand to God and telling you that I stole this idea from the first flaps from Dave Thomas. He rated everything 1 to 10. I had a hard time doing that since there's so many that fall in some of these middle categories, and the price ranges are so large in some of these middle categories that I rated them 1 to 100, and that was probably a mistake, but you know, the book's written, so this is what we got. They start from extremely common, which means little collectability value. There are very few that fall in this, but some do, even though it's 75 years ago. The bulk fall in this center section, as we're going to see here graphed in a minute, and there's a few really high-end pieces that fall in the very rare and extremely rare. If I look at all the pieces we talked about it, and I put it in a color chart so us older guys can understand it, green up here is the items that are in the lowest category, which is particularly odd because remember at the time, region issues were extremely difficult to get. And now compared to the rest of the things in the Wob Handbook, they're the most easy to get. So that's what this green means. These are rated up to 1 to 10, which is the lowest group. This purple group, 15 to 20 is the next group up. Green is the next group up. Purple, light yellow, blue. And when you get to these last 3 groups, you see these are the rarest of the rare pieces. This is where the value goes up. But if I look at the bulk of the collection, this does not make up a bulk collection. So those that are ranked 71 above do not make up the bulk of the pieces. They just make up the bulk of the value. And then if you look at the next page, you can see, what does that mean? 7% of the total number of emblems are ranked above 90, but they represent 70% of the value. So you've heard of the 80-20 rule. It's a little bit different on Wob issues. It's more like the 793 rule on Wob issues. If I jump one back and I look at those that are ranked above 70, 17% of the number of emblems are ranked above 70, but they're 87% of the value. So above 70, if you go back to here, here's there to there. If you want to, if you insist on being a Wob collector and you want the high-end pieces, if you just get 71 above and you get them all, you've got 87% of the value of an entire collection. And the reason I mention that is as I'm certainly an ambassador for Wob collecting, and I would like as many people as possible to do this. In fact, I hope to publish this handbook, and I want to get the point across that you can have a great deal amount of fun collecting this portion of the Wob handbook without getting into these items where you got to get your checkbook out. Please do it. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope that people take advantage of the large number of pieces you can collect without having to really keep your kids out of college or grandkids, if I look who's on the page with me. Okay, Wabaningo Lodge Emblem percentages by ranking. So here's kind of what I'm falling to. 72% of all issues are rated between 11 and 60. So if there's any math majors out here, this area under the curve represents 72% of the area under the whole curve. So there's a lot there. You don't even have to go after the easiest to get. Just get 11 to 60, 69, and you can get a great deal of the Wabaningo handbook. And I think I mentioned this last week too. Since there are so many A and B varieties, you don't have to start out saying, I have to have the exact variety. Get one that's close. I was that person for 25 years, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Okay, so now we're getting into some kind of fun stuff. Putting this book together, I ran into some true experts who were of big help to me, and 73 is a particularly attractive lodge. The piece shown in the Wob handbook is the R3 Brotherhood, which is this guy. So I don't have that. So what I showed in my presentation is only the patches I have. I have an R4, but this is the actual Wob handbook piece. But I wanted to show this. I think these came from David Orrell. You hardly ever see all four of those pictures together. I believe the rarest of the rare is the pledge piece, and I'm not sure of the history behind it. But each piece carries a very scarce designation, which means they're somewhere in the 90s. That's a lot of history on that page right there. Okay, so I promised I was going to talk about some of the prototype issues later. Here's one of the most interesting ones to me. The emblem in the Wabaningo Handbook is the 242 YX1. It is a prototype, and the C1, which issued the Wob members, is shown below. So here's the C1 everybody got. Here's the one shown in the Wob handbook, and I admit they look very similar. And for years, I have chased a chenille with a long, I just said this has a long beak. So I probably had 6 or 8 chenilles and always looked at the long beak, and none of them matched. And I'd think, well, I don't get it. So in my travels to put this book together, I was fortunate enough to run into Fred Bickerton, who is an expert, maybe the expert on 242, along with Tim Withers. And he helped me a great deal. He sent me this picture. So this is left to right, top, middle, bottom. C2, C2, C3A, C3B, all the way down. And you see none of these look like this. See this one with a tail on this side of the arrow? No other chenille made by 242 has a tail on this side of the arrow. This piece right here is a chapter piece, and it has a tail on that side of the arrow. So it helped me, but it still didn't really solve my problem, which is, well, if C1, which is in ISCA book, is described as a Wob issue, it doesn't match. What doesn't match? What is right, and how am I going to tell what's what? So I came up with this idea. Being a PowerPoint person, I noticed if you take a picture in PowerPoint, you can change its transparency. Make it anything you want. So this is an actual high resolution scan from the Wob handbook, 2 of them. This is the C1. I have to take this out of presentation mode to do this. All right, if I take it out of presentation mode, so again, the black and white is out of the Wabaningo handbook, and if I select that and I bring it over and I put it on top of the picture that I had for C1, darn, I'm sorry it doesn't go any faster than this, but any place you see where there's a double image means they don't line up exactly. So if I push the arrow down, I make the arrow line up. This area down here's tail doesn't line up, and the feathers don't line up. If I make the arrow line up just exactly, it doesn't line up back here at all. There's all this blue ghosting. The perimeter is not right at all. So with just this one exercise, I determined that the C1 is not the piece pictured in the Wabaningo Handbook. So the gentleman who owns the only example known of the YX1 was nice enough to loan me a picture and say, well, he believes it is the piece pictured. And if I do this same little trick and I come over here and I say, all right, the piece I'm moving from right to left comes out of the WAB handbook. And if I lay it over exactly the photograph that I got of the YX1, I'm sorry this goes so slow, and you play with it just a little, pretty soon you see, huh, it's exact. So I would say without question, the YX1 is the piece in the Wabaningo handbook because there are no gray items, no gray details. And if you move it just a little bit off, you start to see gray. So it wouldn't be off much to determine, for you to determine what issue it is. So that technique I used on a lot of pieces in this presentation to determine what was what. Without doubt, 242 YX1 is a piece in the WAB handbook. Okay, 272, I touched on that earlier. I always thought the only difference was Dwight put on a 272, and other than that, it was the exact piece. This is the actual certificate of the individual who bought this when Dwight sold it. It has a mechanically applied number, but it has a brown dove. If you remember from the presentation, the actual 272 F1 is a gray dove, and this is stitched in red. So this piece, which carries the designation of YF1, is again a singular piece, and it is the most, is it valuable? It brings the most money should you want to buy it or sell it, because it has such a following being a 272 F1. The Shemalia chenille is certainly just as difficult, but since it doesn't fall in the first flap collection, I don't think it carries quite the value. But to me, they're both off the charts, spectacular pieces. Okay, so I told you that I did these transparencies, and here's one that it's not a particularly valuable piece, but you can see the frustration that I went to try to determine the exact piece. So these are the pieces listed in the ISCA OA insignia description, X1 ABC. This thing on the right is a high resolution scan from the WAB handbook. I did the same trick when I pulled over and put one on top of the other, and none of them matched the WAB handbook. So now what do? I don't have a picture of what the real one is, but I can tell you that none of them watched that WAB handbook. So I was fortunate enough to run an individual who actually had one that matched. And you look it up here, all these things, all will have arrows, all these 8 areas tagged to the border. And there is one issue that all 8 tagged to the border. It isn't in the ISCA book, but they do say in the ISCA book that X1B has many varieties exist. So therefore, I'm designated as the X1B is the WAB issue. You just don't want to find a picture of it online. But these tags, which you can all see when you blow this image up, are in there. And as a side note, you can see how clear and crisp this diameter is drawn. Again, that was drawn by Dwight, though that patch does not have an outline like that. That was hand drawn. Okay, let's keep going. So we talked about 370 earlier. 370 was made by Felt Crafters of Plainstyle, New Hampshire, which is a very prominent manufacturer of Boy Scout patches at that time, leather neckerchief slides. And remember, we used to go to camp, you'd sew in the name of your bathing suit with your name on it. Well, these people made those wash-proof nameplates also. In fact, here's an advertisement for one with Walter P. Carter. So you can buy those from these people and you sew them in your bathing suit, your shirt, and then you get it back at the end of camp. Most patches they made did not stand up well to washing or sewing. So I'm saying the 370J1 is probably the most famous item Felt Crafters ever manufactured. And just since you don't see it very often, that is the back of the patch. There's the Felt Crafters emblem. This is what it looks like in in scale. And what I have here is actually full scale. So you can see that that is a jacket patch, and certainly not the 2.5-inch round that you sometimes see at Trader E's. Again, very rare, but this piece is even more rare. Someone brought this up earlier. The Wab Handbook says they made 50. How many still exist? I don't have any idea. I don't have any idea. Not many, because they don't show up. Maybe 10, maybe 20. I've never seen a real one. I have heard horror stories from some of the big time collectors that there's a wonderful fake of this out there they've been sold a few times, and when someone real researches, they found that it's not, and they have to undo the deal. Don't have any more details, but I would, as I discussed last week, if you run into a 55 leather, I would ask for provenance as I would on this piece. Just off the charts good. This was cool. Tom Quinn gave this to me at the Grapevine Tradery. This is the actual flyer that Dwight put out when he was getting people to order the handbook or asking for corrections. You see everything up here. What's your lodge name? What's the meaning? What's the story behind the choice of the item? Where was it founded? And at the bottom is, and I think he was collecting this for his second edition. At the bottom is, here's how to order one. They were $1.25 each. As we discussed last week, he made 2,000. He sold them all in the first year, because no one had this at the time. This was the first time someone had put together a list, much less pictures, of one patch from most of the existing or the aerial lodges. So I've never seen that. I was very glad to get that, but that's what he went through. So of course, being someone that borrows from somebody else, when I decide to sell mine, I use the same kind of idea. Give me a name and order. Here's how I plan to do it, and I'm being upfront that I borrowed that directly from Dwight Michelle. Okay, in the back of the book, there's another 20 or so pages that talks about lodge without emblems. It's really good information. It tells you what the name of the lodge is, usually what is a totem, what's it mean, where are they from. Not many pictures. I think there's only one, maybe Lodge 60 says emblem not available, but I'm not really sure what to put in for this section. I don't want to just regurgitate what's out there. I may take this off entirely. And I think that's it.